After the earlier bargaining and uneasy talk of alliances, the skull-faced companion broke the tension on the hillside by brushing off caution and proposing what he called a little game. The red-hooded adventurer and the spiky-haired youth traded wary remarks, but the skeleton moved on a whim, drawing up purple, crackling power beneath his cloak and speaking with a grin that grew crueler by the second. He announced the game openly, told them to run, and tore that energy into a hulking violet shape that thundered down the slope toward the fleeing pair. With smoke and dust blowing apart, he taunted them with a 10-second countdown while allies shouted and scrambled to intervene, bewildered at the sudden escalation. One voice urged restraint and pleaded that the charged man had gone too far, even calling out a name, Murain, as the scene split into motion and alarm, leaving the group reeling beneath the advance of the monstrous purple force. After the earlier provocation on the hillside, the scene snapped into motion. The spiky-haired youth gave a brief, strained farewell, "Let's live and meet again, Harrier," and the skull-faced companion finished his cold countdown. Beneath the skeleton's grin, violet energy condensed and swelled into a hulking, crackling entity. The red-hooded figure froze in terror, then began to flee. The skeleton purred that time was up, and the purple behemoth lunged with a roar, closing the distance as the fleeing adventurer screamed. The spiky youth stood rooted, eyes wide and sweat on his brow, powerless as the monstrous form thundered forward. The sequence ended on the aftermath of the release, the creature's charge and the red-hooded's frantic escape dominating the clearing, while the animated skull watched the chaos it had set loose. A wide, sunlit panorama gave way to the looming flank of a purple entity as a cloaked figure held fragile recollections of the little one, the hero, and everyone else who had already disappeared. Despite their absence, the figure preserved those memories internally. The hooded figure coughed and steadied themselves while a mocking voice erupted, sneering at the figure as a second batch and deriding their followers as clueless disciples. The insult coincided with a violent bloom of purple energy that manifested into a roaring, hulking beast, and the red-hooded companion and the spiky-haired youth were shown fleeing across the field as the monstrous form charged. Amid the chaos, the masked figure's resolve hardened. They vowed not to be lost again, to protect the others to the end, and to keep living on as the person they had to be. The sequence closed on a tight, determined gaze through the mask, sealing a quiet promise against the surrounding dread. A sunlit sweep across the hills had given way to a fresh upheaval in the treeline. An eruption left a crater smoking amid the green. A hand rose into frame and cupped the blasted gap as if testing the distance, and a puzzled breath, brief, questioning, cut the calm. From beyond the blast emerged a striking figure in red. She shaded her eyes, advanced with a great sword planted beside a fallen form, and paused above a huge, inert hand half buried in the grass. At her feet, a single white flower pushed up through the disturbed earth, fragile against the ruin. Where others had sworn not to be lost again, the woman's quiet amusement turned to a possessive claim, her voice soft but absolute. She had found whomever or whatever the crater hid. The scene closed on her confident stance over the wreckage, the landscape holding its breath beneath that sharp, final declaration. No sooner had the woman in red staked her claim over the blasted ground than the sky itself answered. A hulking purple colossus descended beyond the treeline and loomed over the clearing. Its arrival sent the small party into a wild scatter. Bodies tumbled as the first devastating blow slammed into the earth and sent shock and purple energy tearing through the grass. One of the companions was seized or struck prey to the impact, crying out and rolling across the dirt, while the red-hooded warrior's face snapped to terrified resolve as she shouted that she might die for real. She lunged toward the wreckage amid a rising dust cloud, begging the assault to stop even as the ground continued to explode around her. When the dust cleared into a cascade of rubble and the colossus's shadow fell over the ruin, the red-hooded adventurer steadied herself on scorched earth and looked up, the battlefield narrowing to a single, impossible opponent. Having steadied herself on scorched earth and narrowed her focus to the impossible opponent, the red-hooded adventurer sprang into motion and closed the distance to the towering purple mass. She opened with a flurry of precise slashes, each strike flashing white against the creature's magenta hide until a deeper wound yawned and she drove forward, plunging through the creature's surface as tendrils of shadow and light writhed around her. The purple form convulsed and bled unnatural energy, and for a moment it seemed the assault had succeeded. The colossus bucked, and a dark humanoid shape shimmered within its bulk. Then the world flipped, something massive seized or enveloped her, and the tempo of battle snapped into a confused, dangerous silence as both attacker and enemy registered the unexpected turn. Distant figures watched as the immediate chaos settled into stunned, tense uncertainty. The sequence opened with the red-hooded adventurer driving a blistering, spinning assault into the purple colossus, her blade carving a wound that pulsed with malignant light. The colossus convulsed and ruptured, disgorging a hurricane of shadow and crimson energy that swept across the battlefield and flattened buildings beneath a rain of warped power. As the dust and fallout settled, distant voices rose in alarm. One shouted, "Mr. Skull," and the scene cut to a small, battered clearing where the talking skeleton lay slumped among toppled gravestones, dazed and half-buried in debris. Survivors clustered, coughing and scrambling to help while tension hung in the air, unsure if the threat had truly passed. From the smoke, a red-haired woman emerged, blade resting on her shoulder. She regarded the shaken villagers with a calm, sharp smile and introduced herself plainly as Frey, offering a brief, steadying presence amid the ruin. An exchange began with a voice naming the red-haired warrior as one of the Empire's 4 knights, Frey of War, and the hooded interlocutor admitted familiarity with the knights. The conversation cut to the red-hooded figure, alone in a battered clearing as tension coalesced. Then Frey moved. She launched a blistering, spinning assault, her blade arcing in a crimson blur that struck with thunderous force. The impact detonated outward in a boom of displaced earth and light, sending shockwaves across the ground and hurling her opponent through the air. Frey landed nimbly and followed through with a series of decisive strikes, driving the foe backward and leaving them battered amid the churned terrain. Observers were left staring as the dust settled, the battlefield marked by a sudden, violent demonstration of why the name of one of the 4 knights inspired both recognition and dread. Frey launched herself in a blistering, spinning onslaught that struck the skull-cloaked opponent full force, the impact detonating outward and hurling him through the churned earth. She landed with poise, grinning as she mocked and baited the fallen figure into standing, then moved in close when he scrambled back. The cloaked skeleton lashed out and briefly seized her, a desperate grapple that flared with purple trim and a flash of contact, but Frey met the grab by breaking range and answering with a concentrated burst of strikes. The sequence narrowed into a brutal exchange of fists and knees, a close-up on Frey's eye, a rapid flurry of blows that pummeled bone and cloth, and the opponent crumpling beneath the red-haired warrior's relentless assault. Dust and motion lines framed the aftermath as Frey's assault left the skull-faced combatant stunned and overwhelmed. Frey's spinning onslaught had already scattered dirt and bone when the skull-cloaked figure crashed to the ground. She landed composed and taunted him, drawing him back into a brutal exchange of strikes that left the opponent beaten and sprawled in the churned earth. The talking skeleton rolled and struggled to its knees, gasping and muttering through ragged speech bubbles as Frey closed in with a sardonic smile. He tried to rise, then exhaled a dark, circular utterance that hung heavy in the air, an ominous pause before action, then cupped a trembling, pale light between his skeletal hands. Frey tightened her grip and ignited the purple edge of her weapon, boots cutting through dust as she advanced. With motion lines and raw momentum, the scene tightened into a standoff, the red-haired warrior poised to strike as the skeleton gathered whatever power remained in its bones. Frey was shown wounded and furious, blood streaking from her face as a violent purple surge erupted nearby. The animated skeleton on the ground barked a harsh command for Murin to take the sword and run, urgency cutting through the smoke and motion lines. A short, frantic retreat began as the small group withdrew. The purple surge condensed into a massive, lupin predator that tore through trees and leapt across the canopy, its bulk and speed shredding the woods and snatching a small figure in its jaws. From a ridge, 2 observers watched the carnage unfold and traded terse words about the danger. One urged flight, while the other bristled at abandoning the scene, underscoring the creature's ferocity and the brittle choices facing the survivors. The sequence closed with the hunters and hunted diverging into the forest, desperate movement, a ravenous purple beast on the prowl, and a thin, bitter resolve settling over those who remained. The group had already been scattered by the earlier purple surge. Frey remained a wounded, furious presence at the edge of the clearing, as a tense quiet settled under leaning trees. A dark-haired youth braced himself and vowed not to abandon the others when a living, magenta-shaded maw erupted through the brush and bounded across the slope with savage speed. The beast slammed into the hillside and seized a flailing companion in its jaws, while nearby figures recoiled and shouted. Without hesitation, the red-haired warrior Frey launched herself from cover, driving a blood-streaked blade in a catastrophic overhead strike. Her sword opened a searing corridor through the creature, and a bloom of purple energy detonated across the glade, shredding foliage and bathing the scene in violent light. When the blast subsided, the immediate menace had been rent apart, but the clearing was left smoking, and the survivors raw, their escape carved into the ruined landscape, and their resolve tempered by cost.